Julian, great to have you back. Can you just remind us in terms of what you do and also your professional experience to date?
Okay, that's it's good to be here, and I'm Julian Stern. I work at BGU as a professor of education and religion, and I mostly supervise doctorates and do research and writing, including on, unsurprisingly, education and religion, but also general philosophy of education, philosophy of schooling, and some specific non-educational philosophical things. But I also have a large research strand in solitude studies, solitude, silence, loneliness, and various other little strands. So I'm a bit of a free range professor working across disciplines and fields, which is great fun and very interesting.
That's great. And before you got into higher education, I understand that you spent some time working in schools. Could you just give a
Yes.
little bit of an overview of what you did?
Yeah, I spent 14 years as a school teacher in secondary school, secondary education, including in six on colleges, teaching social sciences, humanities, RE, history, sociology, politics, English, philosophy, music, and a few other things. I actually first qualified as a piano teacher, which may be relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today, and have worked on various different school subjects and higher education school subjects, including history particularly, and more in religious education, but working on other areas too.
Okay, so that's really helpful to know because obviously we've agreed to talk about creativity in teaching and learning today in this podcast. And so it's a bit of a minefield, I suppose, like when it comes to the topic of creativity. And so one of those things that probably, worth talking about, even though it might actually get quite messy, I suppose, because it's quite a fundamental question that, many people find it difficult to, give a concise answer. But I just wonder, from your perspective, what do you see as creativity?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for asking. And I'll say what I don't think it is, first of all, which is that there is a temptation to think that it's a sort of fluffy and entirely individualized creativity involving variously starving in a garret, waiting for a muse to come, wearing an eccentric hat or other eccentric clothes. Those are all fine, incidentally. I don't mind. Well, I'd rather not starve in a garret, but I understand. I've lived in garrets, uh, and I don't mind, and I have quite a nice collection of hats myself. But for me, creativity is a involves three things, and I'll be reasonably specific about this because I've worked on it and written about it over the years. It involves agency. In other words, it's doing or making something. It's a doing thing involving a responsibility, not necessarily individual agency. It can be collective agency, but agency is involved. Its opposite is obedience, is people have described the difference looking at children paint in schools between those schools that encourage children to paint what they see and children to paint what the teacher sees. And I think that's a lovely description of creative and non-creative education, which we'll come back to. But if you're just painting what someone else sees, if you're just saying what someone else tells you to say, then you don't have agency in that. So agency is important. Originality or newness is important in creativity. Its opposite is oldness, is repeating old things, not doing new things. And it doesn't have to be fashionable new, but it has to be new in some context. And the opposite of originality and newness is also repetition. So if you're repeating the same things, that's also not new. So originality or newness, and for something to be creative, it should also have value. Even if I'm making something, if I'm making something of no value to anyone, no worth, and I know one can argue over what worth is and what value is, but if it has no worth, worthless, then it's not creative. So agency, newness or originality, and value are the three elements that make for creativity for me. And
Mm,
I'm not being terribly original in that, I will admit, because that's taken from various other people like Anna Kraft and other people who've written on
mm,
educational creativity and other philosophers who've written about creativity and
mm,
creation. Incidentally, because I do quite a lot about religions, I find it odd how few people connect creativity and creation. Writers, philosophers like Martin Buber say creation and religious creation narratives are about creativity, and they're
mm,
not different things. So creation and creativity are the same sorts of things.
mm,
Giving birth in creating, as it were, a new human being is a creative act, is the fundamental creative act for bringing new life into the world. And Hannah Arendt has talked about natality, that sort of creativity. So creativity is connected to, amongst other things, religious narratives of creation and to fundamental human being and other creature sorts of creation in giving birth. So it's very fundamental, but agency, newness, and value.
mm. Okay. So just to unpick that slightly, when it comes to agency, you mentioned that it should be something that people do. And so when you say it should be what people do is a doing thing, to what extent are you talking about the actual physical doing of something, or can it be, say, for example, thinking, where you're not actually doing something tangible? Could it still be like, creativity if you were to think about something?
Yeah, yes, it can. I say that with a bit of hesitation in my voice. In universities, and I think this applies to schools, but in universities and in policy, research is called, defined officially in many contexts, internationally as well as nationally, as a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. That is what they call research. And it's not only what university researchers do, it's what school kids do and what teachers do in schools. People investigate, they gain new insights, whether the newness is for them or a small group or large group, or thoroughly globally original as well, can happen too. But new insights effectively shared. Now, the interesting thing is, effective sharing is considered part of research. So you don't do research and then you share it. And I think similar things about creativity, that actually some of the doing, which may be talking or writing or making something else or arguing with people or raising an eyebrow when someone says something, can be a part of your creative act. I don't think thinking on its own is really as creative as something that is actually shared. That creative, I would like to say that being creative, whether someone shares it now or you write it down and it gets burned in a fire when you're gone and no one actually reads it, but some attempt to share is probably part of what makes it agentic and of value. And that being creative in your head is the sort of thing that, yeah, I have fabulous thoughts, but I try and write them down and they fizzle away into nothing. And I fear that that's what most of us would do, that it's a illusion that we're really being creative when it's just happening in our head and
Mm,
there's no sharing with other people or no attempts to write it down or paint it or make it or
mm.
anything like that.
Would you say the sharing of creativity or creative ideas is in some way a, a validation process? Because the reason why I say that is because when we think about particular models of creativity, like Csikszentmihalyi's systems model, the idea is that it creative ideas need some kind of validation to be creative, within a particular system. So would you say that the act of sharing, is related to the validation process?
Yeah, that sounds a bit too passive. I think the sharing, the talking, the drawing, the means of beyond the mind is actually part of the process, because I said you could be creative in responding to someone by raising an eyebrow. They could be part of the creative process. The audience, as it were, is not entirely passive in
Mm,
creative, including in creative arts. I've done work on the art of solitude and the music of solitude and the literature of solitude. And interestingly, in the 19th century, performers like Franz Liszt saw musical performance as a an active dialogue with the audience. It's not something that's done on your own and an audience happens to be there as a witness, or to say, oh, well done, that's of value. They are part of the performance.
mm,
And I think that's an interesting way to think about how you write or how you draw, how you paint or how you talk, is that in talking terms, monologue is very difficult to do, very difficult to define. You may not know who your audience is. We may not know who's listening to us in
mm,
this thing, but we are talking beyond ourselves
mm,
into a potential audience and are influenced by that. Even if we don't know who they are or what they're going to say, we are influenced by a potential, a future audience in
mm.
what we're saying and doing. And it's a much more active thing. So the sharing in research is part of the research because it is already informing the
Mm.
research. How you are doing that is itself informing the research.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like kind of with intent kind of sharing.
That's part of the agency, it's part of the value of what
Mm,
makes it creative and part of the newness, because not just testing you, saying, yeah, but so and so's already said all of that, but
mm,
part of the newness of it is in its reception. Part of the agency is the intention to communicate. Part of the worth, the value of what you're doing, is its value in context, as Csikszentmihalyi says. It's not of value neutrally in the universe floating about. It is of
mm,
value for in this world as it is now, or in this part of this world, in this structure, and
mm.
so on.
Okay. So before we move on to something a bit more specific, I just wanted to sort of clarify with you, what do you mean by newness? As in, what is new? What do you class as new?
In well, chronologically, something that wasn't there before is I suppose it's what I mean. It's a chronological thing. If you have a baby, then that child, that person has never existed before. As the child grows and develops, they, at each stage in their life, they have a difference, a newness to them as they
Mm,
grow. This is crucial, incidentally, to what I'll talk about creative teaching and learning. The children we work with and the adults, for that matter, are constantly making and remaking themselves and are new in the world because they have not been like this before.
mm,
So new in the world means something different. If I, if I publish a poem that's already been published, it is not new in the world unless I have added to it in some way, including maybe a new typeface could be described as a very
mm,
small amount of newness, or with a new introduction or a new explanation or a new framing of it. So I could publish an old poem and it could be an original and creative piece as a publication, but the poem itself might be old, as
mm.
it were.
That's really helpful because I was just trying to tease out in terms of having something new or novel. to what extent does it have to be something completely original? Because I think like this is one thing that some people are concerned that,
Yeah.
does it have to be completely original, that nothing is ever like nothing like it has ever been created,
No.
or can be a synthesis of different ideas that are already in existence, and then to kind of create something that hasn't been presented in the form that it is now coming to light, to make it something different
Yeah.
sufficiently.
It's an interesting thing. If you have a baby, then human beings have been going a long time. They're not, you know, it's not terribly original. Oh, this is a human being. That's not original in itself, but this human being is. The same with ideas. If you've got not just children, but if I talk about doctoral students, they have to do original things, but it could be putting a system, an already established system, in place in a new context. It
Mm.
could be trying out an idea that works here, but trying it out there in this context, in this discipline, in this way, or combining it with another old thing. So two old things combined. Uh, a, uh, a famous, I think, Dadaist, I'm not sure, artist, put a display up of a urinal as the display. Now, a urinal was not an original thing. Having it as part of an art exhibition was. More recently, a banana taped to a screen was sold for, I think, several $1 million. And a banana's not original, tape's not original. Making it an art exhibit presumably was, although I've yet to find out that. And the person who bought it, to be honest, showed his understanding of the absurdity of it by eating the banana. But of course, he owns the right to have banana taped to screen as something that he can do. He owns the rights to that.
Hmm.
So it can be repeated again and again. Now, was that original? Yeah, probably.
Mm.
Is it worth several £1 million? Will someone pay for it? And it was a commentary, and I can't remember what the title is, but the title, as with the urinal, is a commentary. The title of the urinal has commentary in it. Thai concept art is often presenting a concept with a physical artwork, and the concept is often more interesting than
Mm.
the art, the half a cow or banana taped to the wall or urinal. Back
Mm.
more than 100 years ago, the urinal. And children will find out something new. I remember the child who was holding a feather who went to their teacher and said, "Wow, this is really light. It's as light as a," oh, yeah. Now, to them, realizing that the phrase light as a feather meant as light as this thing, this feather, was a great bit of insightful, a great insight for that child there and then. It wasn't original, indeed. But it was it wasn't big original, but it was small original for them in their context. And I'd
Mm.
want to say that was a new finding that he had made about the lightness of this feather that was as thoroughly original in that very small context as, a Picasso painting is in a much
Mm.
larger context, or a banana on a wall.
Yeah.
I'd say is come somewhere between light as a feather and Picasso. I won't say where I think it is on the scale of Picasso to feather.
Yeah, so basically, we're alluding to different levels of creativity, I guess. Okay, so
Different levels of originality, different
yeah,
levels of originality, different qualities, more or less creative. And I'm not one to say creativity is being creative is good enough. Oh, we've
mm,
been creative, that's it. There are still levels.
yeah,
People hate saying levels of creativity. I work on spirituality in education, and people hate the idea that Ofsted in the UK, the inspectors of schools, actually judge how much spiritual development is going on in a school. But I think that's fair enough. Well,
mm,
whether you trust Ofsted or not, the idea of judging spirituality is perfectly reasonable. And
yeah,
religions have been doing that and giving sainthoods out for those who do it well
yeah,
for millennia.
yeah, 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 absolutely. So moving on to something a little bit more specific, and I suppose like what we've spoken so far, to some people might be a little bit abstract. And so I'd quite like to think about or discuss with you about creativity in teaching and learning.
Yeah,
And my first question would be, from your experience, what does creativity in teaching and learning look like? Can you give
yeah,
us some examples, Rick?
yeah.
You know.
I'll start with, and I have two answers, one for teaching, one for learning. And it's worth thinking about what creativity in teaching is, as well as in learning. And I'll start with something that is not entirely without controversy, which is that teachers are contributing to creating people. They are creating persons, helping create persons. They're part of a team, including, most obviously, homes, families, carers, in creating persons and friends and media and other teachers, of course, and other people. But the act of teaching in schools, the act of teaching in universities, the act of teaching anywhere is a creative act because it is creating people. I got this most forthrightly from the philosopher Nell Noddings, who says, we are creating better people, she says. That's what schools are for, to create better people. I hope she's right that we're creating better people. Some people say schools are creating worse people, more obedient, less original, whatever people. But certainly they are creating people, whether they like it or not. They are not simply passing information on. They are helping create people. And I know it's controversial because whenever I say it, people say, no, we're not. And whenever Nell Noddings says it, she says, but what people say to me, what makes a better person will be an interminable argument about that. And she says, I say to them, yes, it's an interminable argument in which we should be participating. So what is it that makes a better person? What is it that makes a person is an argument, needs to be argued about. But I think teaching is fundamentally creative. The creativity it is creating people, helping create people. That's teaching. And that, as I say, is I won't say, well, it's not original, Nell Nodding says it, but it is relatively controversial and a minority view. Learning is creative where it is taking part in investigations that lead to new insights that are effectively shared. The definition of research I apply to all forms of learning. So any learning where you are gaining new insights at different levels and so on, where you are genuinely investigating, you are not simply repeating back, but you are investigating in one way or another and gaining new insights and sharing those insights, then you are doing those things. You have agency. You are not simply obedient. You are having new insights. You are doing something original, and it's somehow of value. Well, we could say, is worthless learning still learning? Well, I suppose it is. But let's say schools and universities should be involved in worthwhile learning. So if it is worthwhile, you will find that out in part through sharing. So those bits of things that make up research are bits of things that make up creativity. All learning is creative. And before you say, is creativity all about splashing paint about and writing poetry? It includes that, and that's great. But it also includes repetitive, annoyingly repetitive and boring activities, maybe even copying out. In Chinese traditional calligraphy, the point of doing calligraphy is to copy the calligraphy of great masters, and one hopes mistresses, of calligraphy. And what they have said, they are masters not because of their handwriting, as it were, but because of what they say. So in copying out the calligraphy of the masters, the great poets, and so on, through Chinese history, you are entering into the spirit. It is in Chinese traditional tradition, you are entering into the spirit of the original writer. So if you are learning Shakespeare's plays, let's transfer it to UK schools. If you are learning Shakespeare's plays, either by writing them out or by memorizing them, you are, as it were, entering into Shakespeare's spirit. If you are learning Beethoven sonatas to play on the piano, you are entering into the spirit of Beethoven. And although learning a play, learning a Shakespeare play, learning a Beethoven sonata is an excruciatingly boring, repetitive thing, it is still part of a creative process. You are being creative in doing that by doing those things. So creative learning isn't all about those awe and wonder moments, those fancy moments, or those apparently arty moments. It can be very repetitive things where you are building up your understanding of a situation, of history, of science, of in art, in religious education, in English, where you are getting into the spirit of these things, including through, as I say, rehearsal and practice. Is what I know as a musician. It's very boring doing your scales and trying to memorize music. It is excruciatingly repetitive, and yet it is a creative activity.
So when it comes to things like pedagogy, as in
Yeah.
teaching practices, what about that? What would it look like in practice to you if it was like, what you would describe as creative pedagogy?
Well, yeah. I'll use another metaphor to describe a creative classroom that might help explain it. And it's another musical one. Apologies for doing all this music, but I enjoy it. And you get good metaphors out of music. The metaphor I use is the difference between a teacher being a soloist, a musical soloist, and playing their music to the class who sit there and listen. That's how some teachers think they have to be creative. In the olden days, maybe they still do it. Teachers sometimes used to bring a guitar in and sing to their class, and they thought this was creative pedagogy. Meanwhile, the pupils, at least in my case, were excruciatingly embarrassed and wished they were anywhere else rather than listening to their teacher play a guitar. But that's adolescence for you as well, I understand. It can still have value. And the model of teacher as soloist and class as audience, even if they're a little bit active, that's not my best model of creative pedagogy. My musical model of creative pedagogy is the teacher is the conductor and the class is the orchestra. In other words, the music you're listening to is of the students in the class, and the teacher is making it happen. So it's very clear that creativity is happening across the classroom, and the teacher is helping make it happen. And it's not just their creative or more or less creative ego that is on display, it is the creativity of the class that matters. And I call this, and in the book on schools and religions, actually, I refer to this as a fictive classroom, a classroom that's not fictional. It's not just imaginary in the sense of stories being imaginary, though they may be used in classrooms, a fictive classroom in which creativity is happening as you are in the classroom, and the creativity is not just the creativity of the teacher, but of the students. And I took that idea of creativity from Martin Buber, who I've mentioned earlier, who talks about the imaginative leap it takes to truly be in dialogue with people. And it's he also talks about it as part of a educational relationship. And he calls this not the imaginative leap into fantasy worlds. They may be good, but not that imaginative leap, but the imaginative leap into the reality of the other person, the other people you are with. So when we are with people, we need to make, and as a pedagogue, we need to make the imaginative leap into the reality of the people in the classroom, the students in the classroom, and they too must make imaginative leaps into other people. What else do we do in history but make imaginative leaps into people in the past? What else do we do in English literature but make imaginative leaps into the poetic or dramatic world of the authors? that the authors have created. He called that imaginative leap into reality as real fantasy in German, imagining the real. So real fantasy, so imagining the real is what goes on in classrooms. So it's not imagination and creativity of simple fiction or art, what we call creative arts. It's into the reality of each other in the classroom, the fictive classroom, and the others beyond the classroom, the historical figures we study in history, the fictional figures we study in English, the worlds, the physical worlds we are studying in science. In all subjects, we are doing this imagining the real. And the subtitle of my book on schools and religions was Imagining the Real. So the fictive classroom, the creative classroom, is one in which we imagine realities of other people and other things as well. That was a rather long and rather definitive answer to a rather loose question about pedagogy.
Well,
so creative pedagogy is creating a fictive classroom.
Right. So if I was a practitioner and I'm listening to what you're saying and I'm thinking, this sounds really interesting, and I'd like to do more of that in a conscious way rather than something that, you just happen to do it without even knowing that you're doing it. What would you say to those people in terms of how they might begin to put that into practice?
Yeah. There's a simple technique that I've repeated, that I've seen in a teacher do in a school, and that I've repeated over and over again. And apologies if you've heard it before, Philip, or anyone else has heard it. And I saw a teacher do this, and I thought, wow, that if nothing else, that could pin it down. Which was, she wouldn't let anyone out of the room. She was an RE teacher, wouldn't let anyone out of the room before everyone in the class had said something new that they had learned in that lesson. Dead easy for the first couple of people to say something new that they'd learned. Incredibly difficult by the time you get to 20, 25, 30. And she had classes of 30. And her classes knew that she was going to do this, and they did it very quickly. It was literally a minute or two. But what have you learned? Dum, dum, dum. She did it different directions around the class, of course, so the different people had a go at doing that. What that did was show that the children, the young people in the class, were expected to have found out something new. Some newness was going on for them. May not have been new for another kid, but newness for them. And they had to have a whole pile of stuff that was new there. And the teacher had to realize what it was that was new there. So the teacher had to be conscious of the original investigations or original findings or insights that the children, young people, were having in her lessons. And that was a simple, I don't mean everyone should do it in every lesson, but that was a heck of a way to test out whether what you've been doing is repeating it. And if a child says, no, I knew it all already, that's a pretty devastating thing. But what always happened in a couple of lessons I saw of that teacher is some of the kids had found out some things, had some insights that the teacher hadn't expected them to have. And so you suddenly realize, for that child, they had picked up on this element that they hadn't expected the child to pick up on, or had understood something that they hadn't thought was part of the lesson, but they'd still picked it up, maybe from another student, but maybe from just how the presentation works. Like light as a feather. They were doing something else with feathers. I don't know if they were drawing a feather. The child who said, wow, miss, this is light as a, oh yeah, and had connected with that analogy of light as a feather in doing something with a feather in a class. So find out, and then you too will be a creative teacher, because you will be realizing how fictive you've been in your class. And I don't say do it every time, but as a pedagogy, that's a simple technique that, believe me, every teacher I've seen do that since then, sometimes at my suggestion, has tended to do that. As a teacher trainer, I used to observe teachers a lot, and this was a trainee teacher who I was observing, very good trainee teacher who I was observing. And I will ask trainee teachers after the lesson, so what did the children learn that they hadn't known before the lesson?
Mm.
And I'll say, if they say, I don't know, then I say, you're not, you know, you need to know. You're a teacher. You have to find out what they're learning that they didn't know. They'll say, often trainee teachers will say, well, I taught about this, 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 and this. And I'll say, yeah, do you know whether they knew that already or not? Is it new for them or not? And then I'll say, I'll pick on a particular person in the room, a student in the room, and say, what did they learn? That was, and if they gradually get round to saying, I think they learned, what did that person? And if they say, I don't know, then say, we'll find out.
Yeah.
Next time, find out, ask them.
So when it comes to creative pedagogy that you've just described, would you say that having effective formative assessment practice is crucial to realizing this creative classroom that you're describing? Just because like what you're describing to me there requires a practitioner to know exactly what the students are learning and how they're kind of like, you know, getting new insights and ideas. And so without knowing that through formative assessment, there is no way to have a creative practice going on.
Yeah, just assessment, never mind formative. All assessment. I've actually published an article about assessment feedback in schools and in universities. And assessment feedback can be a closing off of things, a judgment without any justification, and it can be part of an ongoing dialogue with the student. And those two modes of assessment are not longer or shorter. It doesn't take longer or shorter. It's different sorts of comments by teachers, different smiley faces or different comments, marginal comments, different concluding comments. All of that can be part of an ongoing creative process. And you can call that formative assessment. I just call that assessment. So any assessment can be like that. I just, with two colleagues, put in a few weeks ago to a publisher a book proposal. And yesterday we got back feedback comments on the book proposal. And they were really positive, really short, but really positive about the book proposal. And we're ecstatic about that. And we think they understand, in fact, we think they understand better than we do what the book that we hope to publish is about. And they said some things that suggested they understand dimensions of the topic that we as authors, potential authors, hadn't. So that was assessment, that was summative assessment that the publisher's using to say, yes, we'll go ahead with publishing it. But it was creative. Yeah. It was ongoing dialogic. We can pick up on that. And the publisher wants us to pick up on their comments and do something about it. So all assessment is, or can be more or less creative in that way. Also, simply setting tasks that allow children to be creative. Even memorizing, as I say, even repetitive memorizing can be creative. If you are getting people to copy out in history, as in my A-level history lessons, I could name the teacher, but I won't, who himself wrote on the board out of, he didn't show us it, but out of a history textbook and got us to copy that out. That was the lesson. I don't think that was terribly creative, entering into the spirit. And a couple of us at the back of the room discovered which textbook he had and got it out of the library and occasionally sort of said what he was going to write next just to annoy him. That's not creative writing. Copying out Shakespeare might be, if you're going to do something useful with it. Have I told this anecdote before? After Lady Diana died and Elton John wrote the song, The Candle in the Wind, a school that I know, the head teacher played the song in assembly to all the children in the school, and he got printed out for them the words of the song. And his follow-up to that was, so you've heard the song and you've got the words to the song there. What I want you to do is read that carefully when you go home, because tomorrow we'll have a spelling test based on the words in the song. Now, that's what I call a incredibly creative opportunity, an emotionally creative, personal, emotional, engaging opportunity for something that was a very emotional time in the
Mm.
late 90s for people. Young people today might not remember it, but it was an emotional heart on one's sleeve sort of time for those who
Mm.
cared about the death of Lady Diana in this country. And the head teacher killed it dead, as it were, sucked all the potential creativity out of it by presenting it as an opportunity for a spelling test.
Mm.
Now, other teachers may have done better things with it, and so I'm not saying it was completely killed dead in the school, but I think that's an uncreative task.
Mm. What would you say is the most creative thing that you've ever seen in a classroom before?
Oh, good question. Um, a good example, it's not the most creative thing I've seen in a classroom, but a good example that I've heard from an English lesson, uh, and it comes from a mistake. And the person who reported it said it helped them with their creative lesson. In the old days of blackboards, now you still have some whiteboards. The previous English teacher in the room had written up a poem, and the teacher who reported this didn't have time to clean the board properly and just cleaned one half of the board to give, it was a himself, space to write up today's tasks. When the students came in the room, they looked at it and they said, "Oh, what happens? What happens? What's the end of that line? What does the?" They could see it was a poem, but all the ends of the lines had been rubbed out.
Mm.
And the kids started asking about it. And the teacher said, "Well, it's funny you should say that." They were lying. Well, it was funny to them, but they weren't ready for that. Said, "Because the task today is for you to think how to finish each of these lines in the
Right.
poem. And then what we'll do is we'll introduce you to the poem as originally written and see how your creativity and the poet's creativity, where they overlap, where they're different, and we'll see how poets work,
Mm.
poems work, and how poets work." And the kids got really engaged with this task of finishing the lines of this poem and got really engaged with what the original poem was.
Mm.
And the teacher actually said after that, they started intentionally writing a poem up and wiping off, including, they said, one of their own poems, because they, in their spare time, were a poet. And that got them even more engaged because they realized that students were thinking of things that they hadn't thought of
Mm.
in their own poem. And it was their own poem that they had rubbed the lines off. So that's an example of happenstance leading to genuine, both individual and collective, and with a dead person, the poet, the original poet was dead, dialogue, really fictive classroom.
Mm.
So that's a good example of, and it came by chance
Yeah.
and by bad classroom management because he really should have cleaned the whole board. I think that's terrible. I would always clean the whole board. Nevertheless, I'm not
Yeah.
recommending bad classroom management. Nevertheless, that was a fabulous piece of creative, because it was both individual and creative. I never liked being told, do some creative writing,
Mm.
but I would have been interested in finish the lines of this poem.
Yeah.
It's got a different feel to it, and I could join in that creativity. And it's definitely not just individual muse-like creativity. Definitely sharing is involved.
Mm. So why should we bother with that sort of like approach? Because obviously, like to me, it sounds really interesting, and I think like for me, obviously, from my own personal perspective, this is highly valuable. But from your view, why should practitioners think about trying to be creative? What is the opportunity here? What are the benefits?
I think teaching is a process of creating people, and good teaching is creating better people. Bad teaching is creating worse people, or worse people than might be created.
Mm.
And we don't know unless we find out. But to create a better person, for me, includes a person, and I'm an educationist, so this is hardly surprising, is creating a person who can learn. It's no good if schooling ends when schooling ends. It's no good if university ends when you leave university and that's it, forgotten. You've got a degree, but it has not affected you in any ongoing way. Schooling is not about just what goes on in school, it's what goes on beyond school, after school, at home as well, but also after school chronologically, later in life. And I'm hardly being controversial in saying, I hope I'm not being controversial in saying that being a learner, learning things, which means learning new things, having new insights, is part of what makes a good, a better human being. And it's part of what education should be doing, is making people who are not just learned in the sense of having learned things, but learners are people who continue learning originally in the world, because they in turn will be creating the world in which we will all be growing old in. Let's hope they can do it well. Let's hope they too can be creative. And let's hope they can make a better job of creating a better world than we have managed so far at creating. And they will be creating new people, next generations. They will be running the world. They will be creating the new world that we will be growing old in and that will be existing after we've died. So the reason for being creative is because this is what we are doing in the world. That's why Socrates said this. It's not something, well, Socrates is said to have said this. Plato reported that Socrates said this, and he said it in a very sexist way. He said, women can have babies, that's their creativity, that gives them a sense of immortality, limited immortality. They will die, but their work will carry on because they've created children. Men can't do it, so they can teach. And that is how a teacher creates a sense of some limited immortality, in the sense that they're creating people and ideas and things that last beyond their own lifetime. So I don't think that's true only of women. In other words, I think women clearly have babies, some men can have babies, but those who can't physically have babies can still contribute to the growing of children. And I think that's what teaching's doing. And of course, women can be teachers too, university lecturers too.
So would you say that, because this is one thing that I've often thought about in terms of creativity, what appears to me to be quite striking is that creativity seems to always have a positive connotation, always feels like it's something good. From what you're describing just now, it sounds like if it's something that, why wouldn't anybody want to have that approach? And so can I just quickly check with you that for you, is creativity always a good thing?
No. And again, I've mentioned this anecdote before. There's a book where in the preface, the author credits their history teacher, a Dr. Perch, Poetsch, for inspiring them with an interest in history and an interest in the history of their country and an interest in learning. And I presume the teacher did that. Regrettably, for the teacher's point of view, because he was embarrassed by it, it was Mein Kampf, written by Hitler. Hitler credited his teacher with inspiring him with a love of history and a love of learning and a love of German history. Now, I think the teacher probably did. There's no reason to doubt what Hitler wrote about that. Was that a good thing? The teacher himself survived the war, I believe, and was rather embarrassed by this credit, as it were. And I don't know much about his later life, may have tried to think, how could he have taught differently in a way that wouldn't have inspired the young Adolf to his particular career in politics. And we all think that, maybe. Well, we don't all teach Hitler, but we all think about what is the influence on the people we've taught? How have we influenced them? The things that we've written, how does that influence people? And most of us will have been misrepresented. People will learn the wrong things from us, and we have to be careful. So being creative is not something without specific values. Being creative is, and I built in value, it is of value, and those values may be good values or bad values. In other words, you may be trying to make young people into hyper-nationalistic, racist demagogues. I don't think Dr. Birch was trying to do that, but maybe that was part of what he was trying to do. It's certainly the effect that he had. He helped create a racist, hyper-nationalist demagogue. But hey, that's, if he was trying to do that, shame on him. If he wasn't trying to do that, he was teaching in a way that ended up doing that anyway. So we have to think not only of the values that we hold, the creative values, we're trying to do that, but we need to keep finding out from our students, not only at the time, but later with any luck, what influence that had. That's why assessment is so important. It's assessing our values. It's not just assessing the students, it's assessing us as pedagogues. So no, being creative means creating stuff of value, whether that value, whether we know it, is, we have to find out. That's part of our creative process. And whether it's a good value or not is for others to judge, ourselves and others to judge. And it will not be judged, even in our lifetimes, it may not be judged. I've heard people say that the value of a teacher is only known in the grandchildren of the people they taught. In other words, did what they teach not only outlast them, it would outlast their students who would be passing it on to their children and grandchildren. Only long after you might well be dead, might you learn what the value is of what you've been teaching. That's a sadness, but gardeners plant trees that they will never see as trees, fully grown as trees. So we're used to that, and we should be used to that in teaching. So no, creativity, has value built in, but whether those values are the right ones or not are things we need to keep testing ourselves on. We all have these lovely, it's a bit like, the fluffy end of creativity. We all think we're wonderful, dominated by justice and all of those things. We might not be having that influence, the influence we think.
Yeah, okay. So my second to last question is to do with the definition that you gave us earlier on in terms of what creativity is. If you could give a short piece of advice for each of these elements that you mentioned that define what creativity is for practitioners, what would it be? So the first one, in terms of agency.
So the first one is agency, is you as a professional have agency. Do not think that you are told what to do either by head teachers or inspectors or government policies, or rather do not think that that limits and defines wholly what you do. You are not a professional if you are not making decisions yourself. Being creative, I don't mean disobeying everything you've been told, but being creative in the classroom is a professional responsibility. If you're not being creative, you will be replaced by a computer or an automaton very easily and very quickly. There's no need for you to be there.
Okay. And second, the newness or originality.
Newness, I think how you respond to how young people talk. One of the ways of demonstrating newness is to say, wow, I hadn't thought of that before. It's a simple thing in assessment feedback or in the classroom. If you never have an opportunity to say, wow, I'd not thought of that. That's a really interesting point. If you don't set up lessons where children and young people can say that to you, maths lessons, science lessons, art lessons, any lessons, if you do not have an opportunity to say, wow, I've never thought of that, you're not being a creative teacher. So set up things where that can be said and say it out loud with sincerity. Not, wow, 2 and 2 equals 4. I've never thought of that before. But, something a little more interesting than that. Okay, so that'll be on that. Go on.
Okay, and then finally, value.
Um, People often don't say, teachers, sorry, and university teachers and school teachers often don't say why it's important, what the value is of what they're doing beyond what you might call instrumental value, what the intrinsic value is. Saying this will get you your exam result. This is good. Of course, if you're teaching exam courses, you want your students to get their exam results, and being helpful at that is part of your job. If you do not say what is of value in itself in learning this, why would the students think it's? You may think history is a great subject, but if you don't tell students why you think it's of value, I was reminded of this years ago, or yeah, it was made a higher priority by a hospital teacher who was doing a doctorate. I worked in a hospital school, many of whose students, she said, would die, but she's still teaching them. It's a hospital school. She gets all sorts of government directives about careers. You know, children education should be good for future careers. And she said, what is the value of education to children who will not live beyond school age? What is the value of education to them? I want to know, and I want to be confident in the value of the education to these people who will, many of whom will die well before they leave school. That's a good test. What will happen if they don't even last to the exams? Is it still of value? Can you hand on heart say it's of value? And can you hand on heart tell the students why it's of value? Why it's of value now and why it's of value in the future? What is the point of all of this? And if you can't say it ever, some things you say, yeah, we're just doing this. It's exam practice. We're just doing this to get rid of the anxiety of exams so that you're used to this. It's repetitive, and that will be of value. But look, we're doing this about whatever it is, the structure of the cell. And it's so exciting to understand how that works. It's the building block of life, of all life on Earth. And if you don't understand it, or whatever it is, what excites you about the subject, and tell the students what the worth is in itself, as well as the instrumental value, of course. It'll get you a job or whatever. And if we're all going to be, we're thinking about this now, a lot of children are anxious about war and so on now. I was anxious as a kid. I'm still anxious as an adult about nuclear weapons, all of that. We are all going to die. Is there a value in what we are doing now, even if we're going to die, and even if we're going to die relatively soon? Is there a value? And if you can't think of a value, you're not being a creative teacher, and bracket, you're not being a good teacher. So the value now and in the future.
Yeah. Fascinating. It's been so good to discuss these things in depth with you, honestly. Obviously with it being one of my key interests. And so it's been really valuable for me. And so the value clearly is here for me to embrace. So one final question. If the word creativity tomorrow is suddenly banned and is no longer something that can be allowed to exist, and is deleted in all of the dictionaries everywhere, and in order to promote the value of creativity and what we've spoken about and how important it is today, what would you replace it with in terms of another word that would be able to communicate the same kind of sentiment?
Yeah. Creativity in education was really brought into education in the USA during the arms race. That's what brought creativity, because it was thought that the USSR was beating the USA in the arms race because children in schools and universities were not being sufficiently creative. And it was about creating weapons of mass destruction, amongst other things, being creative in those ways. Any of you who saw Oppenheimer will realize the creative drive is a genuine creative drive to create weapons of mass destruction. The morality of that is a separate issue, but it's clearly creative. And after the war, particularly in the 50s, 60s, creativity started to be used for those very instrumental reasons. creativity is also used to talk about fluffy, you know, paint throwing sort of activities, which may be wonderful, but are very limiting. So I wouldn't be at all sad if creativity goes out of the educational lexicon, because it's used in very misleading ways, both in terms of creating weapons of mass destruction to beat another superpower and to describe a very small corner of creative arts that is a tiny bit of what I think creativity is. I could replace it happily with research and say all schools must involve all people in doing research, because that also involves investigation, insight, sharing, which covers most of the ground of how I defined creativity. Something, you know, something agentic, you doing an investigation, something new insights, and something of value tested both in the insights and in the sharing. So let's call it doing research in schools. That's students doing research and staff doing research in schools. So I'd replace it with that for now. But there are other words. You could do it with living, what it is to be a person as well. You could do it as personhood. And the psychologist Phila de Salmon, who's one of the personal construct psychologists, says we are always making ourselves personal. The personhood is constantly under construction. It is constantly under construction. So we don't get given a self and that's it. We are making ourselves and other people are making us. In fact, she did to me, objects to the idea of teachers making people, because she thinks, no, we are doing it, but we're doing it in dialogue. So I think, okay, it's the same difference. So personhood could do it, a model of personhood that says we construct ourselves in the world, our context, with people, in dialogue. So personhood, so research or personhood could both replace creativity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.